The crack of a whip cut through the dusty air of Oklahoma Territory. 1887, followed by a woman's scream that made every head turn on Cottonwood Row. Eliza Zamora clutched her swollen belly, 6 months heavy with child, as Jasper Wilkes raised the leather lash again. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the dirt-packed street where the crowd gathered, watching the foreman of the Blackwater Ranch deliver punishment to a woman who had collapsed sorting cotton the previous day. "You'll work or you'll bleed," Wilkes shouted, his face twisted with cruelty. "Contract says you owe 3 more months of labor, pregnant or not." Eliza had come west from Georgia after her husband died in a mining accident, seeking work with promises of fair treatment. Instead, she found herself trapped in debt bondage, working endless hours under the scorching Oklahoma sun. When exhaustion and her pregnancy made her collapse yesterday, Wilkes decided to make an example of her. "Please," she begged, her dark eyes wide with terror as she tried to shield her unborn child. "The baby. I cannot stand another." The whip cracked again, but this time it didn't connect. A tall figure had stepped between them, catching the lash around his forearm. Blood immediately soaked through his shirt sleeve, but he didn't flinch. "That's enough," he said, his voice low but carrying across the now silent street. Preston Tucker stood 6 feet tall, trail dust still clinging to his clothes from riding in that morning. His worn Stetson shadowed piercing blue eyes that locked onto Wilkes with deadly focus. He unwrapped the whip from his arm with deliberate slowness. "This ain't your business, Tucker," Wilkes spat, though he took a step back. "This woman signed a labor contract. She owes. No contract allows for whipping a pregnant woman," Preston replied, stepping closer. "Not in any territory I've ridden through." Wilkes glanced around nervously. "Mr. Blackwater won't stand for this interference. Then he can take it up with Marshal Davis." Preston turned to Eliza, who had sunk to her knees in the dirt. Without hesitation, he removed his duster and wrapped it gently around her trembling shoulders. "Madam, can you stand?" She nodded weakly, and he helped her to her feet. The crowd parted as he guided her toward his horse, a sturdy Palomino waiting at the hitching post. "You can't just take her," Wilkes shouted, finding his courage again. "That's Blackwater property." Preston's hand moved to the Colt revolver at his hip. "She's a person, not property, and I'm not asking permission." In one fluid motion, he lifted Eliza onto his horse, then swung up behind her. The crowd remained silent, a mixture of shock, relief, and fear on their faces. Some worked for Blackwater too, and they knew the cost of defiance. "Anyone follows," Preston said quietly, "they'll regret it." He clicked his tongue, and the Palomino trotted down the street, leaving Wilkes fuming in a cloud of dust. Eliza clung weakly to the saddle horn, her breathing shallow. "They'll come after us," she whispered. "Let them try," Preston replied, steering the horse toward the edge of town. "First, we need to get you to a doctor." They rode in silence for several minutes, putting distance between themselves and Oklahoma City's eastern edge. The settlement had grown rapidly since the land run 4 years earlier, but civilization thinned quickly beyond the outskirts. Preston kept to the tree line when possible, watching for pursuit. "Why?" Eliza finally asked, her voice barely audible over the horse's hoofbeats. "Why would you help me?" Preston was quiet for a moment. "My mother was worked to death on a plantation in Georgia. No one stood for her." His jaw tightened. "I won't watch it happen again." "Your arm, it's nothing," he interrupted, though the blood had soaked through to his elbow. "There's a homestead about 3 miles from here. Woman named Sarah runs it. She'll help us." Eliza nodded, too exhausted to argue. The adrenaline that had kept her upright was fading, and she swayed dangerously in the saddle. "Hold on, just a little longer," Preston urged, feeling her weaken. He wrapped one arm securely around her waist, careful to avoid pressing against her belly. "What's your name, Eliza?" "Eliza Zamora." "I'm Preston Tucker." He guided the horse around a rocky outcropping. "How far along are you?" "6 months," she murmured, her head drooping against his chest. "My husband. He died last winter. Mining accident in Georgia." Preston nodded, though she couldn't see it. "I'm sorry to hear that. The baby is all I have left of him." Her voice broke. "They said I could work through the pregnancy, that they'd be fair, but once I signed the contract—" She trailed off, a sob catching in her throat. "Blackwater's been running that scheme for years," Preston said grimly. "Gets desperate folks to sign contracts they can't read, charges them for room and board at rates they can never work off. It's slavery by another name." They crested a small rise, and a modest homestead came into view. A solidly built cabin with smoke rising from the chimney, a small barn, and a corral containing a few horses. As they approached, a gray-haired woman emerged from the cabin, shielding her eyes against the sun. "Preston Tucker, is that you?" she called. Then, noticing Eliza, she hurried forward. "Good Lord, what's happened?" "Blackwater's men," Preston explained tersely as he dismounted, then carefully helped Eliza down. "She needs help, Sarah." "Of course she does. Bring her inside." Sarah's weathered face creased with concern as she took in Eliza's condition. "Blackwater, that devil. One day he'll answer for his sins." The cabin was simple but clean, with a wood stove radiating warmth and the smell of fresh baked bread filling the air. Sarah cleared off a small bed in the corner and Preston gently laid Eliza down. "Let me see her back," Sarah instructed, already gathering supplies from a cabinet. "And then I'll tend to your arm." Preston stepped back, watching as Sarah carefully removed his blood-stained duster from Eliza's shoulders. The back of Eliza's dress was torn in several places, revealing angry red welts. Sarah's expression hardened. "Whipping a pregnant woman," she muttered, shaking her head as she gently cleaned the wounds. "There's a special place in hell for men like that." Eliza winced but remained silent, her hands protectively cradling her belly. After a moment, she asked, "The baby, will it be all right?" "Let me check." Sarah's hands moved expertly over Eliza's abdomen, feeling for movement. After a tense moment, she smiled. "There's a strong kick. Your little one's a fighter, just like its mama." Relief washed over Eliza's face, and she closed her eyes as tears spilled down her cheeks. Sarah turned her attention to Preston, who was attempting to bandage his own arm with his teeth in one hand. "Sit down before you fall down, young man," she ordered, pointing to a chair. "That needs stitching." As Sarah worked on his arm, Preston explained how he'd come upon the scene in town. "I was just passing through," he said, "heading north to the Kansas cattle drives." "Well, your journey's been interrupted," Sarah replied, threading a needle. "Blackwater won't let this go. His pride won't allow it. I know." Preston winced as she began stitching the deep cut. "But I couldn't just ride past." "No, you couldn't." Sarah's voice softened. "Your father would be proud." At the mention of his father, Preston's expression darkened. "He died fighting men like Blackwater." "Yes, he did, and he saved many lives doing it." Sarah tied off the last stitch and wrapped clean bandaging around his arm. "There, try not to tear these open before they heal." From the bed, Eliza watched their exchange. "You two know each other well," Sarah smiled. "Preston's father and I ran a station on the Underground Railroad before the war. When Preston's mother died, his father brought him to me. I raised him for a few years while his father continued the work. Until he was caught and hanged," Preston added flatly. A heavy silence filled the room. Sarah eventually broke it, moving to prepare food. "You both need to eat and then rest. Tomorrow will bring its own troubles." As night fell, Sarah insisted Preston take her bed while she slept in a chair by the fire. Eliza had fallen into an exhausted sleep hours earlier, her body beginning the slow process of healing. In the darkness, Preston lay awake, listening to the night sounds outside the cabin. He hadn't planned on becoming involved in someone else's troubles. The cattle drives in Kansas meant good money, something he desperately needed after a lean winter. But watching that whip fall on a woman carrying a child, he couldn't have ridden away. He turned his head to look at Eliza's sleeping form across the room. Even in the dim firelight, he could see the strength in her face, despite everything she'd endured. Something stirred in him, a desire to protect that went beyond simple decency. Dawn broke with a rooster's crow and the smell of coffee brewing. Preston rose to find Sarah already up, tending to Eliza's wounds again. "How is she?" he asked quietly. "Stronger than she looks," Sarah replied. "The welts aren't infected. With proper care, they'll heal without scarring." Eliza's eyes fluttered open. "Good morning," she said softly, attempting to sit up. "Easy now," Sarah cautioned, helping her. "Your body needs time." "We don't have time," Preston said, peering out the window. "Blackwater's men will be searching. We need to move on." "Move where?" Eliza asked, fear edging her voice. "I have nowhere to go." Preston hesitated. He hadn't thought beyond getting her to safety. "I know a place," he finally said. "A small ranch about 50 miles north. Friend of my father's. It's remote enough that Blackwater wouldn't find you easily." "I can't ask you to take me so far," Eliza protested. "You've already risked enough." "I started this," Preston replied simply. "I'll see it through." Sarah brought them plates of eggs and bacon. "Eat first, then I'll pack supplies for your journey." As they ate, Preston outlined his plan. They would travel by night when possible, avoiding main roads and settlements. It would take 3 or 4 days at a careful pace, but the ranch belonged to a man named Jacob Miller, who had fought alongside Preston's father in the war. "He's a good man," Preston assured Eliza. "He and his wife Emma will welcome you until the baby comes. After that, well, one step at a time." Eliza studied him across the table. "Why are you doing all this for a stranger?" Preston set down his fork, meeting her gaze directly. "Because it's right. And because too many times in my life, I've ridden away when I should have stayed and fought." Something passed between them, then an understanding, perhaps, or the beginnings of trust. Eliza nodded slowly. "Thank you, Preston Tucker." By midday, they were ready to depart. Sarah had packed food, medical supplies, and a few changes of clothing for Eliza. She'd also insisted on giving Preston her deceased husband's rifle. "Blackwater's men won't come with just pistols," she warned, pressing the Winchester into his hands. "Take this. John would want it used to protect the innocent." As Preston helped Eliza onto his horse, Sarah pressed something into her hand, a small leather pouch. "For luck," the older woman whispered. "My mother gave it to me when I came west. Now it's yours." Tears welled in Eliza's eyes as she clutched the gift. "I can never repay your kindness." "Live well," Sarah replied. "That's payment enough." Preston mounted behind Eliza, adjusting his position to support her while giving her space. "We'll send word when we reach Miller's place," he promised Sarah. The older woman nodded. "Be careful. And remember, not everyone out there works for Blackwater, but many owe him favors. Trust carefully." With that warning, they set off, keeping to less traveled paths through the rolling prairie. The June sun beat down mercilessly, but occasional stands of cottonwood offered brief respite. Preston kept a vigilant eye on their surroundings, one hand always near his pistol. "Tell me about yourself," Eliza said after they'd ridden in silence for several miles. "You know my story, but I know little of yours." Preston adjusted his hat against the sun. "Not much to tell. My father was an abolitionist from Pennsylvania, My mother was a slave he helped escape from Georgia. They fell in love during the journey north. His voice grew distant. They were happy from what little I remember. Then my mother took fever when I was 5. After she died, my father couldn't bear to stay in one place. We traveled, helping others escape. When it became too dangerous, he left me with Sarah for a few years. And then, Eliza prompted gently. He was betrayed by someone he trusted. Hanged in Missouri when I was 12. Preston's tone remained even, but his body tensed behind her. Sarah raised me until I was 16. Then I headed west, worked cattle drives, did some scouting for the Army, been roaming ever since. Eliza was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry about your parents," she finally said. "It seems we both know what it's like to lose everything." "Not everything," Preston corrected, his voice softening slightly. "You've got your child, and I've got." He trailed off, then finished. "The freedom my parents died for." They made camp that evening in a small grove beside a creek. Preston helped Eliza dismount, noting how she winced with the movement. "Your back's still paining you," she nodded, carefully lowering herself to sit on a fallen log. "It will heal," she said with quiet determination. "I've endured worse." Something in her tone made Preston look at her more closely. "The contract with Blackwater wasn't your first bad situation, was it?" Eliza stared into the small fire he'd built. "My husband Miguel was a good man, but his family." She shook her head. "They blamed me when the mine collapsed, said I brought bad luck because I'm not full Spanish. My mother was Comanche." Her hand unconsciously touched a simple turquoise pendant at her throat. "When Miguel died, they made it clear I wasn't welcome, so I came west, answering an advertisement for workers needed in Oklahoma Territory. And walked right into Blackwater's trap," Preston finished, setting coffee to boil over the fire. "Yes." Eliza's hands rested on her belly. "When I realized what I'd signed, I tried to escape once. That's when they started watching me more closely, threatening what they'd do when the baby came." Her voice trembled slightly. "They said the child would belong to Blackwater too, to work off my debt." Preston's jaw tightened. "No one's taking your child," he said firmly. "I promise you that." Their eyes met across the fire, and for the first time since he'd rescued her, Eliza smiled, a small, hesitant curve of her lips that transformed her face. "I believe you," she said softly. Something stirred in Preston's chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He quickly busied himself with preparing their simple meal of jerky and hardtack, trying to ignore the unfamiliar warmth spreading through him. As night fell, he insisted Eliza take his bedroll while he kept watch. "Get some rest," he urged. "We've got a long ride tomorrow." She didn't argue, exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. As she settled into the bedroll, she looked up at him. "Preston?" "Yes, thank you, not just for the rescue, but for seeing me as a person. It's been a long time since anyone did that." Her words stayed with him as she drifted to sleep, leaving him to contemplate the strange turn his life had taken in just 24 hours. He'd been a drifter for so long, avoiding attachments, moving on whenever connections began to form. Now he found himself responsible for a pregnant woman's life, riding away from the job he'd been counting on. Yet somehow, it felt right. For the first time in years, he was doing something his father would truly be proud of. Dawn was just breaking when Preston tensed, his hand moving to his revolver. A twig had snapped in the brush nearby, too heavy to be wildlife. He gently shook Eliza awake, pressing a finger to his lips for silence. Her eyes widened with understanding, and she nodded, carefully sitting up. Preston moved to the edge of their small camp, rifle ready. 3 riders appeared through the morning mist, approaching slowly. "That's far enough," Preston called, leveling the Winchester at them. The men stopped, and the leader raised his hand slightly. "We're not looking for trouble," he called back. "Just passing through saw your fire." Preston didn't lower the rifle. "Passing through from where?" The men exchanged glances. "Oklahoma City," one finally answered. "Heading to Fort Smith." "Blackwater send you?" Preston asked bluntly. Their faces revealed the truth before they could deny it. The leader's hand inched toward his holster, but Preston was faster, firing a warning shot that kicked up dirt at their horses' feet. The animals reared in panic. "Next one won't miss," Preston warned. "Turn around and ride back to Blackwater. Tell him the woman is under my protection now." The leader's face twisted with anger. "You're making a mistake, mister. Blackwater don't forget, and he don't forgive." "Neither do I," Preston replied coldly. "Now ride." For a tense moment, it seemed the men might try their luck. Then the leader spat on the ground. "This ain't over," he growled, wheeling his horse around. Preston kept the rifle trained on them until they disappeared from sight. When he turned back to Eliza, she was already packing up their camp with quick, efficient movements. "They'll be back," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "And with more men." Preston nodded grimly. "We need to change our route. They'll be watching the path to Kansas now." "Where will we go?" He considered their options. "West, into the nations. I know some Cherokee who might give us shelter." He helped her mount, noting how the encounter had drained what little color she'd regained. "It's rougher country, but Blackwater's men won't follow us there so easily." They rode hard that day, pushing as fast as Eliza's condition would allow. By nightfall, they'd crossed into Cherokee territory, where the landscape changed to rockier terrain with deeper forests. Preston found a defensible position among some boulders, high enough to see approaching riders. As they ate a cold supper, not risking a fire, Eliza broke their tense silence. "Tell me about these Cherokee friends of yours." Preston relaxed slightly at the change of subject. "Man named Walking Hawk. His English name is Joseph. He fought with my father during the war, then returned to his people. He married a white woman named Rebecca, caused quite a stir." A rare smile crossed his face. "They have a trading post near the Arkansas border. Good people." "And you think they'll help us?" "Walking Hawk considers me family." "He'll help." Preston hesitated, then added, "But we can't stay long. Blackwater has connections, even in the nations." Eliza wrapped her arms around herself against the evening chill. "I'm sorry I've brought this trouble to you." "You didn't bring anything," Preston countered firmly. "I made my choice when I stepped between you and that whip." He moved to sit beside her, draping his coat around her shoulders. "And I'd make it again." Their shoulders touched, and neither moved away. The contact was small but comforting in the gathering darkness. "What was he like?" Eliza asked softly. "Your father?" Preston was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, "Fearless. That's the word that comes to mind. Not that he wasn't afraid, he was, plenty of times, but he never let fear stop him from doing what was right." His voice grew distant with memory. "He used to tell me that courage isn't about not being scared. It's about being terrified and standing your ground anyway. He sounds like a remarkable man." Eliza's hand found his in the darkness. "He raised a remarkable son." Preston's fingers tightened around hers reflexively. The simple human contact sent warmth coursing through him, awakening feelings he'd buried long ago. For a moment, they sat in silence, connected by that small touch. "We should get some rest," he finally said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I'll take first watch." Eliza nodded, reluctantly withdrawing her hand. As she settled into the bedroll, she whispered, "Wake me for second watch. You need rest too." Preston didn't argue, though he had no intention of waking her. She needed the sleep far more than he did. The night passed without incident, but dawn brought new challenges. Eliza woke with a fever, her face flushed and her back wounds angry and hot to the touch. "Infection," Preston muttered, cursing himself for not changing her bandages the previous day. "We pushed too hard." "I'll be fine," Eliza insisted, though her voice was weak. "We need to keep moving." "Not until your fever breaks." Preston's tone brooked no argument. "There's a stream nearby. I'll fetch fresh water and see what herbs I can find. My father taught me a few remedies." He helped her drink, then bathed her forehead with cool water. The fever made her drift in and out of consciousness throughout the day. During one lucid moment, she grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "If I don't make it," she whispered urgently, "promise me you'll save my baby." "You're going to be fine," Preston insisted, unable to contemplate the alternative. "Both of you, promise me," she repeated, her dark eyes burning with intensity. He swallowed hard. "I promise. But it won't come to that." By evening, the herbal poultice he'd made seemed to be helping. The angry redness around her wounds had receded slightly, and her fever wasn't climbing higher. Still, Preston knew they couldn't move yet, leaving them vulnerable if Blackwater's men tracked them this far. He maintained a vigilant watch through the night, startling at every sound in the surrounding forest. At one point, Eliza called out in her fevered sleep, speaking rapid Spanish that he couldn't understand. He soothed her as best he could, stroking her hair until she quieted. Looking down at her face in the moonlight, Preston was struck by how beautiful she was, even in illness. Her strength and dignity in the face of terrible circumstances had touched something deep within him. He found himself praying something he hadn't done since his father died for her recovery. Morning brought blessed relief. Eliza's fever had broken during the night, and though weak, her eyes were clear when she opened them. "You stayed awake all night," she observed, noting the exhaustion etched on Preston's face. "Had to make sure you kept breathing," he replied with a tired smile. Eliza struggled to sit up, and he quickly moved to help her. "Thank you," she murmured, "for everything." Their faces were close, her hand resting on his arm for support. Something shifted between them in that moment, the current that had been building since he'd first stepped between her and the whip suddenly impossible to ignore. Preston found himself leaning closer, drawn by an impulse he couldn't resist. The crack of a rifle shot shattered the moment. The bullet splintered bark off a tree inches from Preston's head. He threw himself over Eliza protectively, dragging her behind the cover of a boulder as more shots rang out. "Found you," a voice called from the tree line. "Blackwater sends his regards." Preston recognized the leader from the group they'd encountered earlier. He reached for his rifle, keeping his body between Eliza and the direction of the shots. "How many?" she whispered, her face pale but composed. "I count 3, Preston replied, peering carefully around the edge of their cover. "But there could be more." "What do we do?" Preston assessed their situation grimly. They were pinned down with limited ammunition and Eliza still too weak to travel quickly. Their horse had bolted at the gunfire, taking some of their supplies with it. "When I start shooting, I need you to crawl along the rocks there," he instructed, pointing to a narrow path between boulders. "It leads down to the stream. Follow it west for about 50 yards and you'll find a small cave behind a waterfall. Hide there, I'll find you." Eliza's eyes widened. "I'm not leaving you to face them alone." "You have to," Preston insisted. "Your baby needs you alive." He checked his revolver and the rifle. "I'll lead them away, then circle back for you." "Preston," she began, but he cut her off. "Please, Eliza, trust me." Their eyes held for a heartbeat, and then she nodded. "Be careful," she whispered, touching his face briefly. Preston took a deep breath, then unleashed a barrage of covering fire that sent Blackwater's men diving for cover. Eliza seized the opportunity to slip away along the path he'd indicated, moving as quickly as her condition allowed. Once certain she was clear, Preston continued firing, deliberately moving in the opposite direction to draw attention away from her escape route. The men took the bait, their return fire following him as he darted from cover to cover. He managed to wing one of them, sending the man howling back into the trees. But as he moved to a new position, pain exploded in his left shoulder. The impact spun him around and he fell hard, losing grip on his rifle. Gritting his teeth against the searing pain, Preston drew his revolver with his right hand. He fired twice more, buying precious seconds as he struggled to his feet and stumbled deeper into the forest. Blood soaked his shirt as he ran, making his vision swim. He had to get far enough away to ensure they wouldn't find Eliza, but the wound was bleeding heavily. After what felt like miles, he finally slowed, leaning against a tree to catch his breath. The voices of his pursuers had faded, but he couldn't be certain they weren't still tracking him. Fighting against increasing weakness, he tore a strip from his shirt and bound the wound as best he could with one hand. Then he began the laborious process of circling back toward the stream, careful to leave minimal tracks. By the time he reached the waterfall, the sun was setting and he was light-headed from blood loss. "Eliza," he called softly, approaching the curtain of water. She appeared instantly, her face transforming from fear to relief when she saw him. The relief turned to horror as she took in his blood-soaked appearance. "You're hurt." She rushed forward to support him as he stumbled. "Just a scratch," he tried to joke, but his legs gave out and he sank to his knees. Eliza helped him into the small cave behind the waterfall. It was barely large enough for two people, but offered concealment and the sound of falling water would mask their voices. "Let me see," she insisted, already working to remove his shirt. The bullet had passed through his shoulder, leaving an entry and exit wound that bled freely. With gentle efficiency that belied her own weakened state, Eliza cleaned the wound with water from the stream, then used strips from her petticoat to bind it tightly. "You need a doctor," she said, her voice tight with worry. "We're a day's ride from Walking Hawk's trading post," Preston replied through gritted teeth, "but our horse is gone." "We'll find it," Eliza said with determination, "or we'll walk if we have to." Preston smiled weakly at her resolve. "You're quite a woman, Eliza Zamora." She blushed slightly, averting her eyes as she finished bandaging his shoulder. "Just returning the favor. You saved my life. And you're saving mine." He reached up with his good arm, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I think perhaps we were meant to find each other." The words slipped out before he could stop them, revealing more of his heart than he'd intended. For a moment, he feared he'd overstepped, but then Eliza's expression softened. "Perhaps we were," she agreed quietly. They spent the night in the small cave, huddled together for warmth and safety. Preston drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain in his shoulder competing with the surprising comfort of Eliza's nearness. At one point, he woke to find her watching him, her eyes reflecting the moonlight that filtered through the falling water. "I was afraid you wouldn't come back," she admitted in a whisper. "I promised I'd find you," he replied simply. "I don't make promises lightly. I'm beginning to understand that about you." Her hand found his in the darkness. "Rest now, I'll keep watch." Morning brought both challenge and unexpected fortune. Preston's fever was mild, his wound painful but not life-threatening. And more remarkably, his palomino had returned, drawn perhaps by familiar scents or simply good fortune. The horse was grazing calmly near the stream when Eliza ventured out to check their surroundings. "Your horse is back," she reported with barely contained excitement. "And no sign of Blackwater's men." Preston managed to stand with her help. They probably think I'm dead or headed in another direction, but we should move quickly anyway." With Eliza's assistance, he mounted, then helped her up behind him. The positions were reversed from their earlier travel, with her arms now wrapped around his waist for support. He found her touch both comforting and distracting as they set off westward. They traveled slowly but steadily, stopping frequently to rest and check Preston's wound. By midday, they crossed a wider river that Preston recognized as a boundary marker. "We're officially in Cherokee land now," he told Eliza. "Walking Hawk's trading post is about 10 miles northwest. Will we make it by nightfall?" Preston nodded, though the movement sent pain lancing through his shoulder. "If we push on." As they rode, he told her more about Walking Hawk, how the Cherokee man had saved his father's life during the war, their unlikely friendship, and the trading post that had become a haven for people of mixed heritage. Rebecca, his wife, was a nurse during the war, Preston explained. "She'll know how to properly tend the shoulder. And they won't mind helping us, hiding us." Preston's good arm tightened reassuringly over her hands at his waist. "They've been hiding people in need for decades. It's practically family tradition." The trading post came into view just as the sun was setting a sturdy log structure with a wide porch, smoke curling from the chimney. Several smaller cabins were scattered nearby, and a corral held a few horses. As they approached, a tall man with silver-streaked black hair stepped onto the porch, a rifle held casually but readily in his hands. "That's close enough," he called, then squinted into the fading light. "Preston, is that you?" "It's me, Walking Hawk," Preston replied, relief evident in his voice. "I've brought a friend, and I could use some of Rebecca's doctoring." The man lowered his rifle immediately, calling over his shoulder, "Rebecca, come quick!" He hurried forward as Preston swayed in the saddle. "What trouble have you found this time, son?" "The kind that follows," Preston answered weakly as Walking Hawk helped Eliza down, then caught Preston as he half fell from the horse. A slender woman with graying brown hair rushed from the trading post, taking in the situation at a glance. "Bring him inside, Joseph," she directed, already rolling up her sleeves. "Young lady, can you walk?" Eliza nodded, following them into the warmth of the building. "I'm Eliza Zamora. Preston rescued me from a man named Blackwater in Oklahoma City." Rebecca's expression darkened. "Blackwater. That explains everything." She directed her husband to lay Preston on a bed in a back room. "I've treated 3 other people who escaped that monster's clutches in the past year." While Rebecca efficiently cleaned and properly dressed Preston's wound, Walking Hawk brought Eliza a bowl of stew and listened to their story. His face grew increasingly grim as she described Blackwater's labor practices and the pursuit. "You were right to come here," he said when she finished. "Blackwater's reach is long, but he treads carefully in Cherokee territory. Too many of our people are armed and unwilling to forget how the white man's promises have proven worthless in the past." Rebecca emerged from the back room, wiping her hands on a cloth. "He'll live," she announced. "The bullet went clean through, missed anything vital. He's lost blood and has a mild fever, but with rest and proper care, he'll recover fully." "Can I see him?" Eliza asked, rising awkwardly with her swollen belly. Rebecca's eyes softened as she noticed Eliza's condition more clearly. "Of course. But first, let me look at your back. Preston mentioned you were whipped." Eliza hesitated, then nodded. Rebecca led her to a separate room where she could examine the wounds privately. "These are healing well," she pronounced after careful inspection. "But you've been through too much stress for a woman in your condition. I want you to rest here for at least a week before traveling further." "We can't stay that long," Eliza protested. "Blackwater's men won't find you here," Rebecca assured her firmly. "We've hidden people far more hunted than you. Now let me show you to Preston." He was awake when they entered, his shoulder bandaged and his color already improved. His face brightened visibly when he saw Eliza. "You look better," she said, moving to sit beside his bed. "So do you." His eyes traveled over her, noting the clean dress Rebecca had provided and the way her hair fell loosely around her shoulders. "Are you all right, the baby?" "We're both fine," she assured him, unconsciously touching her belly. "Rebecca says I need rest, though. She's right." Preston tried to sit up, wincing with the effort. "But we should move on in a day or two. I don't want to bring danger to Walking Hawk's doorstep." "You'll stay until you're strong enough to travel," Rebecca declared from the doorway, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Joseph has already sent word to our network. If Blackwater's men come sniffing around, we'll have warning." After she left, Eliza took Preston's hand. "These are good people." "The best," he agreed. He hesitated, then asked the question that had been weighing on him. "What will you do after the baby comes? Where will you go?" Eliza looked down at their joined hands. "I don't know," she admitted. "I have no family, no money. Before you found me, I had no hope." She raised her eyes to his, vulnerability and strength mingling in her gaze. "What about you? Will you still go north to the cattle drives?" Preston was quiet for a moment. "I've been drifting for years," he finally said. "Taking jobs where I could find them, never staying anywhere long, but lately—" He squeezed her hand gently. "Lately I've been thinking maybe it's time to stop running." Something unspoken passed between them, possibility, perhaps, or the recognition of feelings neither was quite ready to name. "Rest now," Eliza said softly, rising from her seat. "We can talk more tomorrow." But their conversation was interrupted the next morning when Walking Hawk returned from a trip to a nearby settlement with troubling news. Blackwater had put a bounty on Preston's head, $200 dead or alive, and offered $100 for information leading to Eliza's return. "It's too much money," Walking Hawk said grimly. "Even here, someone might be tempted." Preston, sitting up in bed despite Rebecca's protests, nodded grimly. "We need to move on as soon as possible." "Not for at least 3 more days," Rebecca insisted. "That shoulder needs time to heal, or you'll tear it open again at the first hard ride." Walking Hawk considered for a moment. "There's another option. My cousin has a cabin about 30 miles northwest, deep in the hills. It's remote, hard to find unless you know the way. You could stay there until the baby comes." Eliza and Preston exchanged glances. "And after?" she asked quietly. Walking Hawk smiled slightly. "The law doesn't reach far into those hills. People mind their own business. With some help to get started, you could build a life there. Together." Preston asked, his eyes on Eliza. Her cheeks colored, but she didn't look away. "If that's what you want." "It is," he said simply. "More than I've wanted anything in a long time." The days that followed took on a dreamlike quality for Eliza. Despite the lingering threat of Blackwater's bounty hunters, she found herself settling into the gentle rhythm of life at the trading post. Rebecca taught her about medicinal herbs and midwifery, skills that would prove valuable in their remote new home. Walking Hawk took Preston hunting as soon as he was strong enough, showing him the best game trails and teaching him Cherokee methods of moving silently through the forest. In the evenings, they gathered around the fire, sharing stories and making plans. Walking Hawk's network of contacts reported occasional bounty hunters asking questions in nearby settlements, but none had ventured close to the trading post. On their 5th night, as Rebecca and Walking Hawk retired early, Eliza and Preston sat alone by the fire. His arm was healing well and the color had returned to his face. In the firelight, she thought he had never looked more handsome. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, catching her watching him. Eliza smiled. "I was just thinking how strange life is." A week ago I was certain I would die under that whip, or that my baby would be taken from me. Now," she gestured to encompass their surroundings, "now I have hope again." Preston moved to sit beside her on the bench, his good arm gently encircling her shoulders. "I never expected to find you," he said softly. "I've been alone so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to care this deeply for someone." Eliza leaned into his embrace. "I'm still afraid," she confessed, "not just of Blackwater but of this." She placed her hand over his heart. "What if I'm not enough? What if you grow tired of being tied down, Eliza?" Preston turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "I've spent my whole life running from memories, from attachments, from the possibility of loss. Meeting you has made me realize what I've been missing." He touched her cheek gently. "I can't promise we won't face hardships, but I can promise I won't run again. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." In the flickering firelight, with his heart laid bare before her, Eliza saw the truth in his eyes. She leaned forward, closing the distance between them until their lips met in a kiss that felt like coming home. His arms encircled her carefully, mindful of both his injury and her pregnancy. Yet the embrace conveyed a strength and protection that made her feel safer than she had in years. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he whispered. "I think I have since the moment I saw you stand defiant even with a whip at your back." Tears filled Eliza's eyes. "And I love you," she replied. "My brave, stubborn rescuer." The following morning, they shared their decision to marry with Walking Hawk and Rebecca. The older couple exchanged knowing smiles. "About time you figured it out," Rebecca said, hugging Eliza warmly. "Joseph, can you fetch Reverend Williams from the settlement?" Walking Hawk nodded. "I'll go today. He can perform the ceremony tomorrow before you leave for the hills." The simple wedding took place at sunset the next day. Reverend Williams, a gray-haired Cherokee minister who had known Walking Hawk since childhood, spoke the traditional vows with a few Cherokee blessings added. Eliza wore a dress Rebecca had altered to accommodate her pregnancy, with wildflowers woven into her dark hair. Preston, standing tall and proud in a clean shirt borrowed from Walking Hawk, could scarcely take his eyes off her. "I never thought I'd see the day," Rebecca whispered to her husband as they watched the couple exchange rings, simple bands Walking Hawk had traded for with a passing silversmith. Preston Tucker settled at last. "It took the right woman," Walking Hawk replied with a smile. After the ceremony, they shared a feast prepared by Rebecca and several Cherokee women from nearby homesteads. Music and dancing continued well into the night, with Preston and Eliza at the center of the celebration, despite her advanced pregnancy and his healing shoulder. As the festivities wound down, Walking Hawk pulled Preston aside. "I have a wedding gift for you both," he said, leading him to the corral where a sturdy wagon stood loaded with supplies. "Everything you'll need to start your new life: tools, seeds, household goods, and those 2 horses to pull it." He pointed to a matched pair of strong bay geldings. "The journey to the cabin will take 2 days with the wagon, but Eliza will be more comfortable than riding horseback." Overcome with emotion, Preston embraced the older man. "I can never repay you for all this." Walking Hawk returned the embrace firmly. "You already have, son, your family to us. Your father would be proud of the man you've become." They set out at dawn the next morning, following a crude map Walking Hawk had drawn. The wagon was well sprung, making the journey as comfortable as possible for Eliza, now in her 7th month. Preston drove with his good arm, his wounded shoulder still tender but improving daily. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they traveled northwest, with tall pines and rocky outcroppings replacing the rolling prairie. By nightfall of the 2nd day, They reached a narrow valley nestled between forested hills. A small cabin stood near a bubbling creek, smoke already rising from the chimney. "Someone's here," Preston said warily, reaching for his pistol. The cabin door opened and a Cherokee man stepped out, raising his hand in greeting. "Joseph sent me ahead to prepare the place," he called. "I am Thomas, Walking Hawk's cousin." Relief washed over them as they approached. Thomas had indeed prepared well. The cabin was clean, the fireplace lit, and a simple supper waited on the table. He showed them the property: 5 acres of cleared land, a small barn with a milk cow and chickens, and the surrounding forest teeming with game. "Good land," Thomas pronounced. "Remote but fertile. No one will bother you here." He helped unload their wagon, then prepared to depart. "I will return in 1 month to check on you, or sooner if the baby decides to arrive." As they stood on the porch watching him ride away, Eliza leaned against Preston's side. "Our home," she said wonderingly. "I never thought I'd have one again." Preston kissed the top of her head. "It needs work, but we'll make it ours." The following weeks passed in a blur of activity as they settled into their new life. Preston hunted and fished, bringing home deer, rabbit, and trout to supplement the supplies Walking Hawk had provided. Eliza organized their small home, started a garden with Rebecca's seeds, and prepared for the baby's arrival. In the evenings, they sat on the porch watching the sunset over the hills, talking about their pasts and their hopes for the future. Preston spoke more freely about his father's legacy and his mother's quiet strength. Eliza shared stories of her own mother's Comanche traditions and her husband Miguel's dreams of a better life. "He would want me to be happy," she said one evening, her hand resting on her now enormous belly. "To find love again." Preston covered her hand with his own. "And are you happy?" She smiled up at him, radiant in the golden light. "Happier than I ever imagined possible." The baby announced its impending arrival on a stormy night in late August. Preston had been repairing the barn roof when Eliza called out to him, her voice tight with pain. By the time he reached her side, she was leaning against the cabin wall, breathing heavily. "It's time," she gasped. "The baby's coming." Panic flashed through Preston momentarily. They were alone, miles from help, and he knew nothing about delivering babies. But one look at Eliza's face, both frightened and determined, steadied him. "Tell me what to do," he said calmly. With remarkable composure, Eliza directed him to boil water and prepare clean linens, knowledge she had gained from Rebecca. Between contractions, she talked him through what to expect, drawing on her observations of other births. The labor lasted through the night, with Preston alternating between supporting Eliza physically and following her increasingly breathless instructions. As dawn approached, her contractions intensified. "I need to push," she panted, gripping his hands with surprising strength. Preston positioned himself as she directed, his heart pounding with fear and anticipation. "You can do this," he encouraged her. "You're the strongest person I've ever known." With a final, powerful effort and a cry that seemed to echo off the cabin walls, Eliza delivered their child into Preston's waiting hands. The baby boy announced his arrival with a lusty wail that brought tears to Preston's eyes. "A son," he whispered in awe, carefully placing the infant on Eliza's chest. "We have a son." Exhausted but radiant, Eliza cradled the tiny, red-faced boy against her skin. "Hello, little one," she murmured. "We've been waiting for you." Preston sat beside them on the bed, one arm around Eliza's shoulders, his other hand gently touching his son's dark hair. The profound love that washed over him in that moment was unlike anything he'd ever experienced, deeper and more powerful than he could have imagined. "What shall we name him?" Eliza asked, looking up at her husband with tired eyes. Preston considered for a moment. "What was your father's name?" "David," she replied. "And yours?" "Samuel." Preston smiled down at the baby, who had quieted and was blinking up at them with unfocused eyes. "David Samuel Tucker. A strong name for a free man." "Perfect," Eliza agreed, leaning against him contentedly. In the days that followed, they settled into a new rhythm centered around their son's needs. Thomas arrived as promised, bringing more supplies and offering to send word to Walking Hawk about the birth. He also brought news from the outside world. "Blackwater's bounty still stands," he reported gravely, "but interest has waned. Most hunters have moved on to more promising targets." Preston nodded, unsurprised. "And Oklahoma City, any change there?" Thomas hesitated. "Blackwater's operation continues, but there are whispers of federal investigation. His methods have drawn attention." "Not soon enough for those still trapped there," Preston said bitterly. That evening, after Thomas had departed and David was sleeping peacefully in the cradle Preston had crafted, Eliza found her husband standing on the porch, staring thoughtfully into the distance. "What's on your mind?" she asked, slipping her arm around his waist. "I was thinking about Blackwater," he admitted. "About all the people still suffering under his control." Eliza studied his face in the fading light. "You want to do something about it?" It wasn't a question, but he nodded anyway. "My father never turned away from injustice, even when it would have been easier. I've spent years running, telling myself I was honoring his memory by staying alive. But maybe—" He looked down at her. "Maybe there's more I should be doing." Eliza corrected gently. "More we should be doing." "Whatever path you choose, we walk it together now." Preston kissed her forehead tenderly. "For now, our path is here, raising our son, building our home. But someday, when David is older and the bounty is forgotten—" He let the thought hang unfinished. "Someday," Eliza agreed. "But tonight, we celebrate what we have." She led him back inside to where their son slept peacefully, untroubled by the complexities of the world he'd been born into. As they stood together watching the rise and fall of his tiny chest, Preston felt a sense of rightness settle over him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. He had found his place at last, not in endless wandering, but in the love of a woman whose courage matched his own, and a child who represented hope for a better future. Outside, the stars emerged one by one over their small homestead in the Cherokee Hills, while inside, the Tucker family slept peacefully, safe together and free. As the seasons changed, their little homestead flourished. Preston expanded the cabin, adding a second room for David and storage space for the abundant harvests from Eliza's garden. The milk cow produced enough for them to make butter and cheese, which they occasionally traded with neighboring Cherokee families for items they couldn't produce themselves. David grew quickly, a sturdy boy with his mother's dark eyes and his father's determined nature. By his first birthday, he was taking his first tentative steps across the cabin floor, his small face alight with triumph as he toddled between his parents' outstretched arms. "He's going to be tall like you," Eliza observed one evening as she rocked their son to sleep. "And just as stubborn." Preston chuckled, looking up from the leather he was working into a small pair of moccasins for the boy. "As long as he has your heart, we'll be blessed." Life settled into a pleasant rhythm, punctuated by visits from Thomas and occasional trips to Walking Hawk's trading post. The bounty on Preston's head gradually faded from local memory, though they remained cautious when venturing too close to settled areas. In the summer following David's second birthday, their family expanded again with the birth of a daughter they named Sarah Rebecca, after the two women who had helped shape their journey together. Preston proved a more confident assistant during this birth, though his wonder was no less profound as he held his tiny daughter for the first time. She has your smile, he told Eliza as the newborn's lips curled slightly in her sleep. And your nose, poor thing, Eliza teased, earning a gentle kiss from her husband. As their children grew, Preston and Eliza began cautiously expanding their connections to the wider world. They established a small trading relationship with a merchant in the nearest town who asked no questions about their past. Through him, they sold excess produce, furs from Preston's hunting, and intricately beaded moccasins that Eliza crafted using skills her Comanche mother had taught her. News occasionally reached them of changes in Oklahoma Territory. Blackwater's labor practices had indeed drawn federal scrutiny, though the man himself remained powerful and largely untouchable due to his political connections. Justice moves slowly, Walking Hawk commented during one of their visits to the trading post, but it moves nonetheless. By the time David was 5 and Sarah 3, their isolated existence had evolved into a comfortable connection with a small community of mixed heritage families scattered throughout the hills. Their children played with others during gatherings for seasonal celebrations, and Preston and Eliza formed friendships with people who, like them, had found refuge in the borderlands. It was at one such gathering, a harvest celebration in the autumn of 1894, that their past finally caught up with them. Preston was helping organize shooting contests for the men when a stranger approached a weathered man in his 50s with a badge pinned to his vest. Preston Tucker. He asked quietly. Preston tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward the knife at his belt. "Who's asking?" The man held up his hands placatingly. "Name's Marshal James Cooper. I'm not here for any bounty, if that's what you're thinking." "Then why are you here?" The marshal glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I've been building a case against Blackwater for 2 years now. I need witnesses willing to testify about his labor practices." Preston's surprise must have shown on his face because the marshal continued. "Walking Hawk told me where to find you. Said you and your wife might have something to contribute." "My wife was the one who suffered directly," Preston said carefully. "I just helped her escape." "That's part of the story too," Cooper replied. "Look, I know it's asking a lot. Blackwater still has power, but his influence is waning. The territory's moving toward statehood, and the federal authorities want these abuses cleaned up before that happens." Preston studied the man's face, looking for deception. "Why should I trust you?" Cooper reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded letter. "From Sarah Johnson. She thought you might need convincing." Preston unfolded the letter, immediately recognizing Sarah's handwriting. The message was brief but clear. Cooper was trustworthy, and this might be their chance to stop Blackwater for good. "I need to discuss this with my wife," Preston finally said. The marshal nodded. "I'll be in these parts for 3 more days. Walking Hawk knows how to reach me." He turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, what you did taking that whip for a stranger, it's the kind of story that changes minds. People need to hear it." That evening, after the children were asleep, Preston and Eliza sat before the fire discussing the marshal's request. Eliza listened intently as Preston related the conversation and showed her Sarah's letter. "What do you think?" he asked when he'd finished. Eliza was quiet for a long moment, absently touching the turquoise pendant at her throat, a gesture he'd come to recognize as her way of centering herself when making difficult decisions. "I think," she finally said, "that when you stepped between me and that whip, you weren't just saving one woman. You were standing against the kind of injustice your father fought all his life." Her eyes met his, steady and resolute. "If our testimony can help end Blackwater's crimes, how can we not offer it?" "It would mean traveling to Oklahoma City," Preston warned. "Facing him again. Possible danger." "The children would stay with Walking Hawk and Rebecca," Eliza reasoned. And we wouldn't be alone this time. We'd have the law on our side. Preston took her hands in his. Are you certain? You've built a peaceful life here, we both have. A life made possible because you had the courage to act when others looked away. She squeezed his hands. Our children deserve to know that their parents stood for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. The decision made, they met with Marshal Cooper the next day. The plan was straightforward but potentially dangerous. They would travel to Oklahoma City the following month to provide sworn testimony before a federal judge. Other witnesses had been gathered, but Eliza's experience as a pregnant woman subjected to physical abuse would be particularly damning. We'll provide protection, Cooper assured them. But I won't lie to you, Blackwater will fight this with everything he has. November found them journeying back to the place they'd fled years before, their children safely ensconced with Walking Hawk and Rebecca. Oklahoma City had grown considerably since their departure, with new buildings and bustling streets that made it almost unrecognizable. So much has changed, Eliza murmured as they rode into town under escort from 2 deputy marshals. Not everything, Preston replied grimly, nodding toward a familiar figure standing on the steps of the territorial courthouse. Jasper Wilkes, Blackwater's foreman, watching their arrival with naked hatred. Ignore him, Marshal Cooper advised, riding alongside them. He can't touch you now. They were provided rooms in a hotel under guard while awaiting their turn to testify. The proceedings had already been underway for a week, with former workers sharing stories of abuse, fraud, and near-slavery conditions at Blackwater's operations. On their second morning, Eliza was called to the stand. Preston watched with pride and concern as his wife, dressed in her finest clothes, swore her oath and faced the crowded courtroom. Blackwater himself sat at the defense table, older and heavier than Preston remembered, but with the same cold eyes and air of untouchable authority. With quiet dignity, Eliza recounted her experiences. The deceptive contract, the harsh conditions, the threats, and finally, the public whipping when her pregnancy made her unable to keep working at the expected pace. Her voice remained steady even as she described the terror of those moments, her fear for her unborn child and Preston's intervention. And did Mr. Blackwater ever personally observe the conditions you've described? The prosecutor asked. Yes, Eliza replied firmly. He visited the fields regularly. He was present the day I was whipped, watching from his carriage. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Blackwater's face darkened, and he leaned to whisper urgently to his lawyer. Preston testified next, describing what he'd witnessed and his actions. When asked why he'd intervened, he answered simply, because it was wrong, and no one else was stopping it. The defense attorney tried to discredit them both, suggesting Preston had stolen Eliza because he wanted her for himself, and implying their marriage was proof of ulterior motives. But their straightforward answers and obvious devotion to each other only seemed to strengthen their credibility with the judge and jury. The trial continued for another week, with more witnesses and mountains of evidence about Blackwater's operations. Through it all, Preston and Eliza remained under guard, acutely aware of the hostile glances from Blackwater's supporters in town. On the final day of testimony, as they left the courthouse, Wilkes confronted them on the street despite the deputy's presence. "You think this changes anything?" he snarled, stepping into their path. "Mr. Blackwater has friends in high places. He'll be back in business before you reach the territory line." "Step aside, Wilkes," one deputy warned, hand on his pistol. "I'm just having a friendly conversation," Wilkes replied with a malicious smile. He looked directly at Eliza. "How's that brat of yours, the one you were carrying when you ran? Shame if anything happened to, he never finished the threat. Preston's fist connected with his jaw with enough force to send him sprawling into the street. The deputies moved quickly to restrain Preston, but he made no further move toward the fallen man. "My husband was defending me from a threat against our child," Eliza said calmly to the deputies. "I trust that's understood." The older deputy nodded slowly. "Didn't hear any threat. Just saw a man trip and fall in the street. Happens all the time on these uneven boards." Wilkes picked himself up, spitting blood. "This ain't over," he muttered, but retreated when the deputies stepped forward. That evening, as they packed for their departure the following morning, Marshal Cooper brought unexpected news to their hotel room. "Blackwater's skipped town," he announced without preamble. "Left in the middle of the night with whatever assets he could liquidate quickly. His lawyer claims not to know where he's headed." "So he escapes justice," Preston said bitterly. Cooper shook his head. "He's running because he knows the verdict is coming against him. His properties here will be seized, his operations shut down. And I've telegraphed descriptions to marshals across 3 territories. He won't find it easy to start over." "What about Wilkes and the other foremen?" Eliza asked. "Warrants are being prepared," Cooper assured them. "This isn't the perfect justice you deserve, but it's something. The workers still in bondage will be freed, compensated as much as possible from seized assets." It wasn't everything they'd hoped for, but as they traveled home to their children, there was satisfaction in knowing they'd helped bring an end to Blackwater's operation. The threat against their family remained a concern, but as Preston pointed out, Blackwater was now the one running, not them. "And we have friends," Eliza added as they approached Walking Hawk's trading post where their children waited. "A community that protects its own." Their reunion with David and Sarah was joyous, both children flinging themselves into their parents' arms with delighted squeals. That night, as they prepared to continue the journey home to their cabin, Walking Hawk presented them with a gift, a framed document. "A proper deed to your land," he explained. "Filed with both Cherokee and territorial authorities, no one can challenge your right to it now." Preston stared at the document in amazement. "How did you manage this?" Walking Hawk smiled enigmatically. "Let's just say your testimony earned you some influential admirers. This ensures your children's future, whatever changes statehood might bring." The journey home felt like a victory lap, despite the lingering concern about Blackwater's threats. Their cabin welcomed them back, untouched and waiting, and life gradually resumed its peaceful rhythm. 2 months later, Marshal Cooper visited with news. Blackwater had been captured trying to cross into Mexico and was now in federal custody. Wilkes and 3 other foremen had also been arrested and were awaiting trial. "You should know," Cooper added, "that your testimony has led to wider investigations. Similar operations in 3 other territories are being examined now." The knowledge that their stand had far-reaching effects beyond their personal situation brought a sense of fulfillment that completed their happiness. As spring bloomed across their land, Preston expanded their garden and added a small orchard, while Eliza began teaching at an informal school for the children of nearby families. On a warm evening in early summer, as they sat on their expanded porch watching their children chase fireflies in the twilight, Preston turned to his wife with a contented smile. "Did you ever imagine, that day in Oklahoma City, that life could bring us here?" he asked, taking her hand in his. Eliza leaned against his shoulder, watching David help his little sister capture a glowing insect in her cupped hands. "No," she admitted softly. "In that moment, I only hoped to survive until the next sunrise." She turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the day's last light. "You gave me more than rescue, Preston. You gave me a future. We gave it to each other," he corrected gently, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And we're still riding it day by day." As darkness settled over their homestead, and the children tired of their game, Preston and Eliza called them in for bedtime stories. Later, with the household quiet and the night sounds of the forest creating a peaceful backdrop, they lay together in the darkness, whispering plans for tomorrow, next season, the years ahead. The life they'd built wasn't perfect. There would always be challenges, always be fights worth fighting beyond their peaceful valley. But in each other's arms, they found the strength and purpose that had once seemed impossible. From the moment a desperate cowboy had stepped between a pregnant woman and a whip, their destinies had been intertwined, a love story written not in grand gestures but in daily acts of courage, compassion, and unwavering devotion. And in the generations that followed, the story of Preston and Eliza Tucker would be told and retold, a testament to the power of one brave choice to change not just two lives, but countless others.